So our first article, we're going to have our very good guest, Jason, leading us in. Take it away, sir.
Thanks, Richard. I appreciate it. Now, this article is on simplypsychology.org, and it's called the Humanistic Approach. Saul McLeod wrote it, and it was updated in 2020. Now, what they're talking about is what they're calling humanistic psychology. Now, humanistic psychology is a perspective that emphasizes looking at the whole person and the uniqueness of each individual. Humanistic psychology begins with the existential assumptions that people have free will and are motivated to achieve their potential and self actualize. Now, they go on to explain that the humanistic approach in psychology developed as a rebellion against what some psychologists saw as limitations of the behaviorist and the psychodynamic psychology approach that was so popular in the 60s and early 70s. Now, I would love to hear Cynthia's view on this because we did talk about it a little bit prior to the show. And if you would, Cynthia, I would love to hear what you have to say.
Yes, I have things to say because I wrote them down
Good.
about humanistic psychology. You know when I first was reading like the articles about this subject, it seemed pretty interesting. Um, because it was a divergence of like the traditional psychology. Now, working in a social service back area, and I often am referring people to therapy, and oftentimes they are taking advantage of like talk therapy, cognitive behavior therapy, things of that nature. And I know that like for our particular organization, we take like we call it a harm reduction approach when
Mhm.
it comes to healthcare, including like when we are doing or doling out site therapy. So I've kind of thought when I first got exposed to this whole thing that this is what they were dealing with, and how they were actually doing like non-traditional methods when it comes to engaging a person, when it comes to trying to evaluate them psychologically. However, one of my issues that I have
Mhm.
specifically with this is that it's a divergence from the scientific method when we are talking about actually diagnosing the patient. Matter of fact, I believe that that's one of the things that I wrote in my notes concerning this whole thing. Like, if you are not using, traditional scientific methods rather, in order for you to come to a conclusion when you are dealing with a patient, how are you going to accurately diagnose a person?
Yeah.
Now, it's kind of weird, only because like psychology in of itself does not follow like a specific pattern when it comes to the scientists like chemistry, biology,
Mhm.
physics, etc. Right? The mind is still very much so a mystery to us as human beings, right? Even though that we've learned a lot about the brain, but we are still having a lot of different discourses and debates, even when it comes to like how the mind functions,
Mhm.
consciousness, what makes a person sentient, and then
Mhm.
how do and even in those particular cases, using that and then seeing like how different behavior health issues may develop in a person. But and keeping all that in mind, then we have to consider like we may have to come with a different approach when it comes to like diagnoses, or
Mhm.
even how we're mapping all these different things when it comes to behavioral health in of itself. So we're going to probably have to come with different philosophies on how to approach this.
Mhm.
But there's still a scientific method that any scientist community would utilize in order for us to come
Mhm.
to proper conclusions, and this one kind of diverges from that, and that kind of is a red flag to me. But I want to have Jason, I'm not Jason, you already entered this whole discourse for us. I meant Kelley. I would love for you to chime in and get like your thoughts of what you thought about this whole subject.
You know, honestly, my one big problem that I had with this whole idea of humanistic psychology was the reliance that it had on the idea that everyone strives for
Mhm.
self-actualization.
Oh,
Hmm.
yeah.
And
Yeah.
I don't know that that's true, right? For one, a lot of people don't have the ability to strive for self-actualization. And if you actually read what they recommend to be able to do this self-actualize, it all sounds really akin to woo to me. It sounds a lot like the people who come into my rock shop to buy healing crystals. It's almost the exact same language. And it's sort of like they're trying to put this scientific face on bullshit to me.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just totally what it looks like to me, is bullshit.
Mm.
So and as you mentioned, they kind of like threw away the scientific method too. So I'm just kind of puzzled by the whole thing. That is this really even a science? Is this, can you really call this psychology, or is it just, like I say, is it just BS, you know?
Mhm.
I didn't, one of the things is that I know a lot of it was based on the work of Maslow, and I went back and I read some of his stuff, and he had some really good ideas. And it seems like even he had some really goofy stuff that led into this too. But it seems like even a lot of his good ideas were kind of warped more into this new age, I don't even know what to call it. I don't want to use the word bullshit again, but it's the only one that keeps coming to mind.
Well,
Right?
let's call it new age psychology. How about that? Does that work? Maybe.
No.
I don't know. No. Okay.
No.
Sorry. I'll just throw that out.
That's like creation science, you know. I mean, that's
okay,
come on.
Gotcha.
There are some red flags in there. I think I struggle not with calling this bullshit, but I'd struggle with the argument around psychology, because there are a lot of people who think that they are proper scientists, who dismiss psychology and many social sciences out of hand because they don't consider them proper science, and this only, I think, exasperates that. And the many red flags, as both Cynthia and Kelley touched on. I made a list of some of them, and I might repeat what a couple of you have already said here, but it assumes that people have free will, and that's a conversation in itself. It assumes that people are basically good. I saw nothing in the article that showed how they were assessing that statement. It just seemed to be an assertion. People, as Kelley said, are motivated to self-actualize, which it was described as psychological growth, fulfillment, and satisfaction in life, which again is incredibly vague. The subjective, conscious experience is most important. And the focus on psychology is how individuals interpret events. Now, that sounds to me like it could lead to unhealthy or bad ideas being promoted, because just because the individual feels good with them. And finally, again, as has already been mentioned, it rejects scientific methodology, and it asserts that the best way to understand people is to talk with them and understand their feelings. Now, all of those things are red flags there, Cynthia.
Yeah, I mean, and to your point, when you were talking about specifically the, how are we actually coming to these conclusions, right? Especially like when you're using this methodology of psychology. First off, you mentioned it already, and I think that I also said it too, is that there is already a debate about psychology in of itself being a real science. I believe that, like, one of the articles that I kind of pulled when I was doing like some additional research was from the American psychologists reviewing an issue within the field that has marred its reputation about psychology in of itself, that the author suggests that the field needs a complete cultural change if it wants to be called science, right? And one of the things, and another thing that I forgot to mention, and I think that this kind of goes around with the list that you were giving, Richard, is that humanistic psychology in of itself, when it's gathering data, is qualitative, it's not quantitative.
Yep.
So what is qualitative? What is qualitative? It's qualitative data is defined as non-numerical data such as text, video, photographs, or audio recordings. And this type of data can be collected using diary accounts or in-depth interviews and analyzed using grounded theory in thematic analysis. Now, okay, there are some ways that you can utilize psychology and use quantitative data.
Oh, there's
Okay.
a lot.
Oh, yeah. Tons. But like when you're just using just qualitative data or alone in order for you to draw conclusions, you're going to have problems. And I believe that the main issue that you're going to have with this is that when you are using qualitative research, depending on who the researcher is, oftentimes they imbue their own perceptions and biases when they're gathering data. And especially on the outgroups that they're gathering data on. This has been an issue even before we even came up with humanistic psychology in the first place, when you're talking about behaviorism and some of the other, like, weird ways. Like specifically, like when I remember studying psychology, when I was in college, when we were like looking at Freud and like how he came up with some of like his particular aspects of psychology in itself. Some of it was quite nebulous. I really also believe that some of it was very much so influenced on his use of cocaine, but that's neither here nor there. Going back to what I was saying before. So we're still going to have like this whole particular issue when it comes to like, gathering data that could possibly be non-biased in order for you to draw conclusions. And I don't necessarily think the qualitative data always is going to lead you into that. Jason, what were your thoughts on that?
Yeah, this is something that I took a humanistic positive psychology course about 2 semesters ago, and I was in an argument for about 4.5 months with my professor. The things that really, I've been doing great because I'm currently finishing up my Bachelor of Science in psychology with a focus on the biological psychology, developmental psychology, abnormal psychology, the science aspects of psychology, and how behavior is related with brain development and so on and so forth. The thing that really irks me about this, there's 2 things that y'all stole all the great stuff. So the 2 things y'all didn't highlight on that really stand out. One, they dismiss animal research and say what you will about animal research. That is ignorant and that is destructive, because a hypothalamus is a hypothalamus on a primate. It's a hypothalamus. You're this, you're that, whatever your brain structure, your prefrontal cortex. If you put a lesion on this happens. If you put a lesion on this happens. We see behavior changes. We see physical changes, the inability to lift your arm up, but you can lift it out, the inability to do this. And we see those same, if we damage a lesion, if we put a lesion on a primate's brain, and then we study that and compare it to lesions on a human's brain, you're going to see the same thing happening. Same thing happening with rats. Same thing happening with other animals. So to dismiss that is foolhardy and dangerous. And then the second thing that really stands out to me is this is a very racist, ethnocentric philosophy, because the idea of self-actualizing is a primarily Western individualistic cultural idea. It is something that has been pushed on us, that we individualize. If again, okay, so some psychological metrics. I wish my books are over in the other room. I wish I had them. But if you study,
just pull them out of your head, Jason.
I will, because I love this, because I argued with my teacher about this for months. Yeah, my partner remembers it was the first time I got a C in a psychology class. It makes me so mad. So if you study development and ideas of identity and self between collectivistic cultures versus individualistic cultures, collectivistic being primarily traditionally Eastern, and then and individualistic being USA. Yeah, I'm me, I'm an army of one, blah, blah, blah. The idea of self and self involvement and self identity takes longer to develop in a collectivistic culture, because you're not so obsessed with self. The group, there's an understanding of the group is number one. You're there to benefit everybody, your family. You're in debt to your family. the idea of self-actualization, like Richard and everybody else hit upon, what is that? How do you measure that? I can see what happens to my brain. I can see my temperament, which we see as a biological thing. I can see my environment. I can see my psychology, my biology. If I'm injured, if we put all these things together, and that's that nice little epigenetic pinball machine, and so what they're doing is, to me, it feels like they're spitting in the face of facts. They're doing some of that woo that Kelley talked about. Cynthia and Richard both hit upon the discarding of the scientific method. I mean, at that moment, and at the moment somebody says that, my ears turn off and I'm done.
Kelley.
Yeah, that the throwing away the scientific method really bothered me, and they're relying on journal entries and personal stories, and this is anecdotal evidence. This is exactly what science rejects as evidence, right? So I don't, and like as you mentioned, psychology is already on a weak foot with a lot of the hard sciences and the people who follow them. I think psychology is fascinating, and I'm a geologist, so I'm one of those hard scientists, but I accept psychology as a science, and I find it really fascinating. But I understand and know people who feel just the opposite, who don't think it is. So when you add something like this into it, it's just making it worse, right? It's that whole idea. And I hate to see that happen, because I really do think psychology can be useful, but when you're doing this stuff, you're just turning it into new age dribble. I always say new age is one word, so it rhymes with sewage. New age.
Yeah, I think one thing we've not mentioned yet so far is that we should, and I don't know if anybody has, but I think it's very easy to confuse humanistic psychology with humanism. And they are not the same things. I'm going to pass this on over to Jason, because I can see him chomping at the bit to get at this one.
I brought this up earlier on, and that's what really irks me, because to me, being a humanist is being a skeptic, is using logic, reason, adhering, just being concerned about increasing well-being and decreasing suffering. The more bullshit, the more wooey, subjective, this is just how I feel, the more we do that, the more we cause harm. We see religions causing harm who do that very thing. We see ideologies, like especially here in Texas, causing harm that do that same thing. We see hatred of queer people. We see hatred of women. We see hatred of minorities, all these slurs that people throw around based on, this is how I feel, and this is what makes me feel good. And this is no. It's to be a humanist is to seek truth and to increase well-being. And if something is not verifiable and not falsifiable, we must necessarily dismiss it, because at that point you're operating with fucking faith, and faith is not a reliable pathway to truth. And we can fuck a lot of stuff up relying on faith.
Oh, trust. If somebody quotes to me a Hebrews 1:11, 11:1 one more time, I swear I will stab myself in the right eye on camera. Trust, blood and the whole socket.
Don't do that.
Will just come out. Now, faith. No, don't you dare. You better not do it. Don't do it. But, like piggybacking on what Jason said specifically about humanism, it is also about bettering humans. It's really about promoting well-being. I know that all of us here, non-believers, have wrestled with the question from a theist: where do you get your morals from? And my main thing is, I don't have a fund to bail me out if I decide to just kick the shit out of you. So it is in my best interest not to do you harm. And I don't necessarily, and that's not going to really help us as a community of human beings to be able to move forward if we're constantly doing harm to one another. It's not a thing that's going to really help us. So why engage in it? And I mean, like, and also too, like that whole like exerting energy, especially not in exercising does not help in any shape, way, or form. So why engage in it? It's silly. Don't do that shit. I encourage people, please don't harm other people. Don't beat them up. It's no point. Quit that shit. And in this particular area, I think that like I don't necessarily want to completely dismiss humanistic psychology. I think that there are some points, especially like as asking open-ended questions to people, like if they're in therapy sessions, in order for them to open up so that you can kind of garner some information specifically from them. I think it's a good idea. I know that like following a script all the time when you are dealing with other people is not always going to be helpful, as far, especially like when you're trying to get to the root of the issue that's going with them. So I don't want to necessarily completely throw everything out, like the baby with the bathwater, right? But you know, it still has a lot of weaknesses to it. And I know this will be my final thought. Just it's the subjective concepts. It's difficult to test. As you all mentioned before, Jason, you mentioned specifically, human and animal behavior not necessarily being able to be compared, especially when we are, all animals. And there's definitely, certain behaviors that animals actually do exhibit, especially if they're getting injured in the brain, that we can actually utilize. And also, like, I hear that whole thing, especially with the self-actualization, where it could be considered racist, especially totally racist. I mean, which there's been tons of data that has been pulled, especially when we're talking about this whole thing about meritocracy. I hear a lot of times, oh, America is a meritocracy. No, it is not. It is not. It's going to, if you are in the environment where it's going to garner for you to do better, you will. But if you're in an environment where where there's different issues that's going to be stacked against you, it's going to be harder for you to self-actualize. And then let's also even think about this. What the fuck does self-actualization mean? It's going to be very different depending on the individual itself. Because self-actualization means, for me, is I got up, took a shower, and brushed my teeth. I self-actualize all the fucking day. For somebody else, it's going to be, I just crushed the stock market. So a lot of that stuff is very subjective, very point to perception, not necessarily something that's rooted in objectivity, and that's going to be a problem.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna just touch on one quick thing that you said, and then I'm going to give it to Jason to lead us out. I think there are some good elements to this, and I don't think the good elements to this are the problem with it. I think the major problem with this for me is the complete rejection of the things they don't agree with, and that's the problem with this. There are some good ideas within it, and if those are promoted alongside scientific methodology and other forms of psychology, it would make a really good system, but they don't. They completely reject everything else, and for me, that is my main bugbear with this. Jason, would you like to take us out, sir?
Yeah, I just wanted to hit on self-actualization real quick. In my off semester, I have gotten into the deep, dark world of criminal psychology and been obsessing over serial killers. And what a lot of these guys talk about is I found me. I self-actualized. I found myself. I feel so good about this now because now I know what I was meant for. So, just leave it at that. If those guys are self-actualizing and I'm self-actualizing, what's the metric at that point? And we don't want them to self-actualize. So maybe they shouldn't go under this method, if they're trying to get treatment.
That part.
Yeah. This is an interesting topic, and I'm sure all four of us could talk about it all day. We spent a great deal of time talking it behind the scenes before we even started. So we'll leave it there for today. It's something I'd love to come back to in future.